The cinematic landscape of modern Hollywood has rarely witnessed a figure as stubbornly tethered to the mythos of the American frontier as Kevin Costner. For over 4 decades, his on-screen persona has been defined by a steadfast adherence to traditional values, portraying men who anchor themselves against the shifting winds of modernity to protect their land, their families, and their honor. Yet, as the current chapter of his life unfolds, the battlegrounds he occupies have shifted dramatically from the carefully choreographed realms of silver screen fiction to the chaotic, unforgiving realities of personal and professional vulnerability. Having recently walked away from the most lucrative television phenomenon of the decade, poured an astronomical fortune of his own money into a sweeping independent passion project, and endured a highly publicized divorce that laid bare his financial mechanics, Costner finds himself standing at a profound cultural crossroads. This transitional period feels distinctly uncomfortable for an icon whose entire brand was constructed on a foundation of absolute certainty and quiet strength, forcing both the actor and his global audience to confront the fragile reality beneath a carefully manufactured Hollywood legend. To understand the profound nature of his current gamble, one must look beyond the rugged cowboy exterior and examine the shifting, unstable foundations of his early life. Born in the working-class community of Linwood, California, and briefly raised in Compton, Costner's childhood was defined not by deep roots, but by a nomadic existence dictated by his father's career advancements as an electrician and utilities executive. This frequent uprooting forced the young Costner to navigate an ever-changing sequence of neighborhoods, schools, and social hierarchies across the California landscape, moving from Ventura to Visalia and numerous towns in between. Each relocation brought with it the crushing, quiet pressure of being the perpetual outsider, a structural instability that Costner later admitted deeply eroded his adolescent confidence and left him feeling fundamentally unanchored. Far from the natural center of attention, he became a quiet observer of human behavior, developing a defensive shell of silence while trying to decipher the unspoken rules of each new social ecosystem he was thrust into, an experience that quietly shaped his artistic perspective. Academic environments offered little comfort or distinction for the young nomad, who found the rigid structures of the classroom far less intuitive than the clear, objective boundaries of the athletic field. He gravitated instinctively toward competitive sports, channeling his anxieties into football and baseball, where success was measured in tangible yards and runs rather than the complex, exhausting social dynamics of high school hallways. On the field, he discovered a temporary sense of clarity and purpose, yet beneath this conventional jock exterior lay a deeply reflective and surprisingly artistic inner life that he kept largely hidden from his peers. He quietly took piano lessons, explored the vulnerable world of poetry, and sang in the First Baptist Choir, showcasing a creative duality that baffled those who viewed him solely through an athletic lens. It was during this formative childhood window that a viewing of the cinematic masterpiece How the West Was Won left an indelible psychological imprint on his imagination, sparking a lifelong fascination with vast horizons and moral conflicts. The sweeping landscapes, complex ethical dilemmas, and foundational myths of the American frontier depicted in that epic film became much more than a passing childhood interest. They established a permanent internal compass that would guide his future artistic choices. Even as he enrolled at California State University, Fullerton, to pursue a sensible, risk-averse degree in business administration, the romantic pull of the horizon lingered quietly in the back of his mind. During his college years, he consciously conformed to the expected trajectory of a traditional suburban professional, joining a prominent fraternity, playing collegiate baseball, and preparing himself for a predictable life within marketing or corporate management. There was no grand, dramatic epiphany on campus that signaled a shift toward the theatrical arts, nor did he display the flamboyant ambitions typical of young actors trying to break into the industry. Instead, he seemed entirely poised to enter the corporate workforce, viewing his creative inclinations as mere hobbies rather than the foundation for a revolutionary career that would alter Hollywood history. The trajectory of his entire life altered course during an extraordinary, chance encounter on a commercial flight, returning from his Mexican honeymoon with his college sweetheart Cindy Silva. Sitting just a few seats away from him was the legendary, tempestuous British acting icon Richard Burton, a performer known for both his towering genius and his deep disillusionment with the heavy price of fame. Gathering an uncharacteristic amount of raw courage, the young business graduate approached the legendary actor to ask a single, burning question that had begun to consume him. Could a man maintain his personal integrity and stay true to himself while navigating the corrupting, superficial world of professional acting? Burton looked at the earnest young man, recognized the genuine conflict brewing within him, and offered a piece of advice that would echo through Costner's mind for decades, telling him that if he truly felt the artistic call, he must pursue it completely. That brief hushed conversation in the cabin of an airplane served as the ultimate catalyst, granting Costner the psychological permission he desperately needed to abandon his corporate safety net and imagine a radically different destiny. The immediate aftermath of that monumental decision was devoid of any Hollywood glamour, defined instead by years of grueling, unglamorous physical labor and persistent economic hardship. To support his young family while attending intensive acting classes 5 nights a week, Costner took whatever odd jobs came his way, working long hours on commercial fishing boats, driving delivery trucks, and operating tour buses that showed wealthy tourists the lavish homes of established movie stars. He spent months earning a meager pittance as a low-level stage manager at Raleigh Studios, constantly surrounded by the machinery of filmmaking while remaining firmly on the outside looking in. While his college classmates were securing stable corporate salaries, purchasing suburban homes, and climbing the corporate ladder, Costner was consciously embracing a life of severe financial instability because the alternative felt fundamentally dishonest to his soul. He briefly accepted a traditional marketing position after graduation to appease familial expectations, but the stifling environment crushed his spirit, leading him to walk away after a mere 30 days to face the terrifying unknown. His ultimate breakthrough into the upper echelons of the entertainment industry did not materialize overnight, but was rather the result of a slow, agonizing process of attrition marked by devastating creative setbacks. He secured small, fleeting roles in minor films that did little to advance his profile, and most famously, he suffered the devastating blow of having his entire performance as a suicide victim completely excised from the final cut of the hit drama The Big Chill. Rather than allowing these systemic rejections to break his resolve, Costner used the disappointments to fuel his professional determination, a stubborn persistence that finally bore fruit when director Brian De Palma cast him as Elliot Ness in the violent masterpiece The Untouchables. The film introduced his stoic, unblinking screen presence to a massive global audience, establishing him as a modern embodiment of classic American righteousness. This breakthrough was quickly solidified by his performance in Bull Durham, a film that perfectly showcased his effortless, everyman charisma and transformed him into a bona fide romantic leading man. With his stardom firmly established, Costner chose to execute one of the most audacious creative gambles in modern cinematic history by stepping behind the camera to direct and star in Dances with Wolves. The conventional wisdom in Hollywood at the time dictated that a 3-hour Western, spoken largely in the native Lakota language, was a commercial suicide note that would permanently destroy his ascending career. Industry insiders mockingly labeled the expensive, logistically troubled production Kevin's Gate, predicting an epic financial disaster that would bankrupt its backers and serve as a cautionary tale of star ego, defying every cynical expectation. The deeply poetic film became an unprecedented global box office juggernaut and swept the Academy Awards, earning Costner the coveted trophies for Best Picture and Best Director over formidable competition like Martin Scorsese. At that moment, Costner was no longer just a popular actor. He had transformed into a cinematic titan associated with frontier integrity, monumental artistic vision, and an uncanny ability to turn creative stubbornness into cultural gold. Yet, as the history of Hollywood repeatedly demonstrates, the legends that are the most carefully and grandly constructed are never entirely immune to the violent professional storms that inevitably follow such rapid ascension. In the volatile ecosystem of the entertainment industry, the immense distance between absolute creative triumph and public humiliation is often measured in a matter of months, a harsh reality Costner would soon learn firsthand. Standing at the absolute peak of his industry after his Oscar triumph, he commanded a level of creative control and financial leverage that only a handful of filmmakers in history had ever wielded. He was a multi-hyphenate force, actor, director, producer, and studio executive, possessing the unique authority to greenlight massive projects based solely on his personal conviction. This level of unmitigated authority brings unparalleled creative freedom, but it also strips away all protective barriers, ensuring that when a project inevitably falters, there is no one else to shoulder the blame. By the mid-1990s, the pristine facade of his professional dominance and the stability of his personal life began to fracture simultaneously. The initial tremors of this profound unraveling occurred within the private sphere of his home, far away from the flashing cameras of movie premieres and industry galas. His marriage to Cindy Silva, the woman who had stood by his side since his days as an unknown college student and who shared 3 children with him, was rapidly deteriorating under the immense pressure of his global fame. Their relationship had endured for 16 years, growing from the shared hardships of his early struggles into the surreal, isolating environment of international superstardom. When the marriage finally collapsed into divorce, the separation was anything but quiet, becoming a permanent fixture in tabloid headlines and exposing the deeply painful realities of a family being torn apart. Costner later confessed that the failure of this foundational relationship weighed on his psyche far more heavily than any box office failure ever could. For a man who had publicly aligned his entire identity with the preservation of family legacy and traditional moral structures, this profound domestic loss cut to the absolute bone. Part 2. As his personal life fractured, Costner was simultaneously navigating the most logistically chaotic and financially perilous production of his career, the futuristic waterborne epic Waterworld. The project was envisioned as a groundbreaking, visually stunning post-apocalyptic spectacle, but the decision to film on the open ocean off the coast of Hawaii transformed the shoot into an absolute logistical nightmare. Unpredictable tropical storms repeatedly battered the production, completely destroying multi-million-dollar floating sets and forcing the filming schedule to expand by several agonizing months. As the budget ballooned far beyond its original estimates to become the most expensive movie ever made at the time, the mainstream media began circling the production like vultures, reporting daily on the spiraling costs. Whispers of intense creative friction between Costner and his longtime director Kevin Reynolds surfaced repeatedly in the press, painting a picture of an out-of-control ego run amok on the high seas. When Reynolds eventually walked away from the film during the final editing process, it cemented the public perception that Costner had become an uncompromising autocrat. While Waterworld eventually reclaimed its massive budget through international ticket sales and home video markets, the damaging narrative surrounding its troubled production remained permanently affixed to Costner's name. The cultural conversation was no longer focused on his artistic innovation, his physical bravery, or his willingness to push the boundaries of cinematic spectacle. It became an industry shorthand for Hollywood hubris and financial overreach. The aura of effortless commercial invincibility that had defined his career since the late 1980s began to rapidly erode, leaving him vulnerable to intense industry skepticism. Rather than retreating to safer, more conventional studio fare to rebuild his standing, Costner doubled down on his epic sensibilities by directing and starring in The Postman. He believed implicitly in the story's deeply earnest, emotional core about a fractured post-apocalyptic America rebuilt through the restoration of communication and hope. Unfortunately, film critics were entirely unreceptive to his sincere patriotism, savaging the film with devastating reviews and delighting in awarding it multiple Razzie Awards for cinematic failure. This consecutive string of high-profile, expensive misfires altered the trajectory of his career, transforming him from Hollywood's golden boy into a high-risk gamble for major studio executives. The industry grew deeply cautious around his sweeping visions, and the man who once dictated his own terms to major studios now faced a wall of polite rejection and creative compromise. Throughout the early 2000s, Costner struggled mightily to regain his former creative momentum, appearing in a series of mid-budget thrillers and dramas that failed to set the box office on fire. Films like 3,000 Miles to Graceland and Dragonfly were met with collective cultural indifference, doing little to restore his status as a dominant cultural force. The undeniable truth was that his absolute dominance over the cultural zeitgeist had evaporated, replaced by the harsh reality of middle-aged irrelevance in an industry increasingly obsessed with youth and comic book franchises. Yet, true to the resilient nature of the frontier characters he so admired, Costner refused to allow these professional setbacks to define the final chapter of his story. The long road back to cultural relevance began in 2012 with his searing, grounded performance in the acclaimed television miniseries Hatfields and McCoys. The project reminded both audiences and jaded industry executives of his immense dramatic gravity and earned him a well-deserved Primetime Emmy Award for lead actor. This television triumph laid the conceptual groundwork for an even more spectacular cultural resurrection a few years later when he accepted the role of John Dutton in Paramount's Yellowstone. The modern Western series, created by Taylor Sheridan, transformed almost overnight into an absolute juggernaut, capturing the imagination of a massive, underserved segment of the American viewing public. As the conservative ranch patriarch fighting a brutal, multi-front war to preserve his ancestral land, Costner found a role that fit his aging screen persona with absolute perfection. The character's deep obsession with defensive legacy, territorial control, and traditional family structures felt intensely personal, mirroring Costner's own historical battles over artistic identity and creative independence. Yellowstone did more than just revive his career. It completely re-established him as one of the most visible, highly compensated, and culturally relevant stars on the planet. For 5 glorious seasons, he stood at the absolute center of a media empire, earning a reported salary that exceeded $1 million per individual episode. To millions of devoted viewers around the globe, the boundary between the actor and the character began to blur entirely. He was no longer merely playing John Dutton, he was the living embodiment of the American West. However, beneath the surface of this massive commercial success, the familiar undercurrents of creative dissatisfaction and operational instability began to re-emerge behind closed studio doors. The show's complex production schedules shifted repeatedly due to unprecedented global shutdowns, subsequent industry-wide labor strikes, and the creator's ever-expanding slate of spin-off series. For an actor who required strict operational clarity to balance his own burgeoning creative ambitions, these constant structural delays created an atmosphere of toxic operational tension. The primary source of this internal friction was not a simple dispute over salary, but rather a profound collision between a secure television gig and a long-dormant artistic obsession. For over 30 years, Costner had carried the conceptual blueprints for a massive, multi-part cinematic tapestry titled Horizon, an American saga. He envisioned this project not as a conventional feature film designed for easy multiplex consumption, but as a sweeping, historically accurate exploration of the American frontier expansion. This was a monumental, four-part epic that would require him to simultaneously direct, co-write, produce, and star in a narrative of unprecedented scale and complexity. It was an artistic endeavor driven by pure, unadulterated passion rather than calculated commercial opportunism, representing everything he valued about the power of long-form cinematic storytelling. When the producers of Yellowstone split their final season into separate filming blocks, the newly revised production calendar crashed directly into the pre-production schedule for Horizon. The trade publications were quickly filled with conflicting reports, with anonymous sources claiming that Costner was demanding a drastically reduced shooting schedule that compromised the integrity of the television series. Costner fiercely and publicly rejected these characterizations, stating that he had consistently rearranged his life to accommodate the show's shifting timelines, only to be met with delayed scripts and administrative chaos. The narrative in the press rapidly escalated into a full-blown public relations war, hinting at a clash of titanic egos between Costner and showrunner Taylor Sheridan. Costner later revealed that profound creative disagreements regarding the narrative trajectory of John Dutton's character arc had further alienated him from the production. Additionally, complex financial disputes regarding contractual pay-or-play provisions and delayed long-term compensation structures served to completely sever his relationship with the network. To a stunned television audience, the face of the definitive modern Western franchise was abruptly walking away from his signature role before the story was officially completed. For Costner, this dramatic exit was framed not as an act of petulant rebellion against the industry, but as an absolute artistic necessity to fulfill a lifelong creative promise. Yet, in the cynical arena of modern Hollywood, superficial perception almost always completely outweighs nuanced reality, and headlines focused entirely on the salacious narrative of backstage conflict. Simultaneously, his personal stability suffered another devastating blow when his second wife, Christine Baumgartner, filed for divorce after nearly 2 decades of marriage. The ensuing legal proceedings immediately devolved into a highly visible, public battle over vast real estate holdings, complex corporate structures, and massive child support demands. Every intimate detail of his financial success, his monthly expenditures, and his private lifestyle expectations was dragged into the public record for global consumption. Within the span of a few turbulent months, Costner had voluntarily walked away from a highly lucrative television contract, invested tens of millions of his own personal fortune into an independent cinematic gamble, and entered a financially bruising divorce. Part 3. The extraordinary nature of this financial risk cannot be overstated. It represents a level of personal exposure that modern movie stars almost never undertake in an era dominated by corporate studio financing. To fund the initial chapters of Horizon, Costner went so far as to mortgage his spectacularly valuable multi-acre coastal estate in Santa Barbara, placing his personal wealth directly on the line. This absolute refusal to play it safe within the comforting confines of a hit television show highlights the core philosophical engine that has driven his entire career. For Costner, the American West has never functioned as a mere aesthetic backdrop for simple morality plays or thrilling action sequences. It represents a profound moral arena where the human soul is tested. This deep reverence for the historical reality of the frontier became explicitly apparent during his involvement as narrator and executive producer for the documentary project The West. In researching the unvarnished history of the migration, he consciously chose to look past the comforting, romanticized myths of Hollywood westerns to confront the grim, tragic realities of the historical record. What he discovered during this historical deep dive was a reality deeply marked by profound human tragedy, systemic violence, and immense moral compromise. Rather than celebrating the westward expansion as an uncomplicated, heroic march of civilization, Costner used his platform to speak candidly about the darker, often ignored currents of American history. He spoke eloquently about the devastating impact of white settlers pushing relentlessly westward, driving indigenous populations from their ancestral lands through military force and broken treaties. He highlighted the painful ironies of early missionary movements that arrived with promises of salvation, only to systematically erase native cultures and impose foreign identities. He openly acknowledged how frontier towns were founded on violence, how historical records were systematically rewritten to comfort the victors, and how brutal displacement was culturally justified. He passionately argued that history must be treated with the same uncompromising objectivity as professional sports, asserting that just as a stadium scoreboard cannot lie about the outcome of a game, the historical record must not be softened to appease modern sensitivities. This uncompromising worldview is perfectly illustrated by his fascination with historical figures like John Colter, one of the original mountain men who famously navigated the uncharted wilderness of the American interior. Colter survived unimaginable physical hardships, brutal winter terrain, extreme isolation, and terrifying encounters with hostile forces, yet his extraordinary life did not culminate in material wealth or celebrated glory. Instead, his story ended in relative obscurity, physical exhaustion, and financial hardship, a recurring pattern that Costner discovered across the biographies of genuine frontier pioneers. For Costner, the true story of the West was built not on a foundation of effortless cinematic courage, but on a grim reality of endurance, betrayal, individual ambition, and immense personal sacrifice. It is entirely impossible to listen to him discuss these historical cycles of triumph and subsequent reckoning without drawing direct parallels to the dramatic arc of his own Hollywood existence. He has lived through those exact rhythms, standing atop the world at the Academy Awards before enduring years of public mockery, professional isolation, and financial peril. His legendary stubbornness and willingness to endure profound physical discomfort for the sake of his art was vividly demonstrated during the production of the historical drama Hidden Figures. While filming his pivotal scenes as a NASA director, Costner was secretly suffering from the agonizing, debilitating pain of severe kidney stones, a condition that would have easily sidelined any other Hollywood actor. Rather than halting the expensive production or demanding special accommodations from the studio, he spent his days on set connected to a concealed intravenous drip, quietly managing the blinding pain between takes. He refused to miss a single day of work because he possessed an old-school, blue-collar work ethic that viewed a professional commitment as an absolute, unbreakable contract. This stubborn refusal to yield in the face of immense physical adversity mirrors the exact brand of frontier resilience he has spent his entire life projecting onto the silver screen. It is a philosophy that dictates that a man's worth is measured entirely by his ability to stand his ground when every external force is screaming at him to retreat. This rigid adherence to personal principle was further demonstrated during his complex, exhausting legal battles following the catastrophic BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Decades prior to the disaster, Costner had invested millions of his own dollars into developing advanced, industrial-scale oil separation technology through his company Ocean Therapy Solutions. When the spill occurred, the technology was deployed to aid in the cleanup, but the venture quickly devolved into a bitter federal lawsuit brought by former business partners who accused him of financial deception. Rather than quietly settling the high-stakes lawsuit to avoid negative press coverage, Costner insisted on taking the case to a federal jury to defend his personal integrity. He ultimately prevailed completely in the court of law, but the grueling legal process permanently fractured lifelong professional relationships and left him with a hollow sense of victory. The experience reinforced his belief that standing up for one's name and reputation is an inherently lonely, costly endeavor that rarely concludes with clean, celebratory endings. Throughout his long journey, various business ventures have come and went, with ambitious casino developments collapsing into protracted litigation while other real estate investments flourished beyond measure. His ultimate financial standing remains incredibly substantial, yet his personal stability has always felt like something that must be actively earned through combat rather than permanently guaranteed by status. Today, as he promotes Horizon, Costner speaks about the historical reality of the American frontier without a shred of modern romanticism or nostalgic sentimentality. He describes the West as a raw, unforgiving, and deeply complicated landscape where humanity's noblest instincts and most depraved impulses operated side by side in the mud. There are no simple heroes in his worldview, nor are there any perfect, neatly wrapped Hollywood endings to be found at the conclusion of his historical sagas. It is precisely this raw, morally ambiguous complexity that continues to draw him back to the Western genre, as it perfectly mirrors the tumultuous terrain of his own life history. With the release of Horizon, Costner has consciously chosen to risk absolutely everything: his professional reputation, his industry standing, and his hard-earned personal fortune on a single monumental creative vision. The sheer, uncompromising scale of the project reflects a lifelong obsession with frontier storytelling that refuses to adapt to the risk-averse realities of the modern theatrical market. In a deeply symbolic move, he has integrated his own family directly into the production, casting his young son in a pivotal role and speaking with immense paternal pride about the experience of working side by side on a film set. For Costner, this multi-part epic is clearly no longer just another entry in a lengthy filmography. It is a definitive legacy piece designed to outlive the temporary trends of contemporary culture. Yet, the commercial stakes of this gamble are absolutely terrifying in an industry that has largely abandoned original, adult-oriented epic dramas in favor of safe, corporate-approved intellectual property. By completely severing his ties with Yellowstone, he permanently walked away from an effortless, guaranteed source of generational wealth that could have comfortably funded his retirement. His highly publicized divorce has significantly complicated his long-term financial landscape, while the media narrative has subtly shifted from celebrating a triumphant career comeback to analyzing a chaotic, high-stakes departure. Through it all, Costner remains characteristically defiant against his critics, insisting that a true artist must always follow the pull of genuine passion, rather than the comforting safety of professional convenience. He continues to assert that a man's name and artistic legacy matter infinitely more than a secure settlement check, pointing to a lifetime of professional battles as proof of his willingness to lose everything to preserve his creative independence. The ultimate question that now faces the entertainment industry is whether this monumental gamble will restore him to the apex of cinematic achievement or sink him into a quagmire of financial ruin. He has successfully reinvented himself before against impossible odds, but this current moment feels undeniably heavier because the monumental risks he faces are entirely self-imposed.